For 7 years, I cried on his grave. 7 years of birthday cards I never sent. 7 anniversaries I spent alone with a candle. 7 Novembers I couldn't bear to open the curtains. I was 31 when they buried his empty coffin. I was 38 when I picked up a magazine in a dentist's waiting room and saw his face, smiling, in a tuxedo, on the steps of a billionaire's mansion, engaged to another woman. He wasn't dead, he had never been dead. He had simply walked out of my life and into a richer one. But here's what he didn't know. The woman he left behind to grieve a man who never existed was about to become someone he should have stayed dead to avoid. This isn't a story about revenge. It's a story about a woman who lost 7 years and decided not to lose 40 more. Stay with me until the end, because the truth she uncovered is something every woman watching this needs to hear. Before we begin, if you've ever loved someone who turned out to be a stranger, if you've ever grieved something that wasn't real, please tap that like button, subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this, and tell me in the comments, have you ever ignored a small voice that turned out to be right? Now, let me tell you what happened that Tuesday in October.
The receptionist was humming. That was the first thing Margaret Halloran noticed that Tuesday morning. A small sound, tuneless. The kind of humming people did when they weren't thinking about it. Maggie was 45 minutes early for her dental cleaning. She was always early. Tess said it was because she was afraid of being alone in her car with her thoughts. Maggie said it was because she was responsible. They were both right. The waiting room smelled like rubbing alcohol and old magazines. The light was fluorescent. The chairs were the color of weak tea. A small fish tank bubbled in the corner. One fish, orange, swimming in slow, tired circles. Maggie sat down. She crossed her ankles. She picked up a magazine from the table. Hampton Society Quarterly, October issue. She didn't read magazines like this. She lived in a one-bedroom apartment in New Haven. She arranged flowers for a living. She drove a 10-year-old Toyota. She bought her clothes at outlet malls. But the receptionist was still humming. The clock on the wall was loud. She needed something to look at. She opened to the first page. The cover photograph was of a wedding announcement. A blonde woman in a long white gown. A man with his arm around her waist. The headline read, Whitfield Ashford, wedding to be the event of the season. Maggie stared at the photograph. The man on the cover had a scar above his left eyebrow. A small one, shaped like a crescent moon. She knew that scar. She had traced it with her thumb 1,000 times, on 1,000 mornings, in a small apartment in Boston, 7 years ago. He had gotten it when he was 9 years old. Falling off a bike, his father said he wasn't ready for. He had told her the story on their third date. He had laughed when he told it. He had a laugh that came up from his chest, not from his throat. The man in the photograph was, according to the caption, named Daniel Whitfield, hedge fund manager, founder of Whitfield Capital Partners, engaged to Vivian Ashford, daughter of Charles Ashford. Maggie's fiancé had been named Daniel Cross. Her fiancé had died 7 years ago. The magazine slipped out of her hands. It landed on the carpet with a soft sound. The receptionist looked up. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Maggie did not answer. She bent down. She picked up the magazine. She looked at the photograph again. Same scar, same crooked smile, pulling higher on the right side. Same hands, the hands she had held when they buried his empty coffin. "Ma'am." The receptionist had stopped humming. "Ma'am, should I get you some water?" Maggie stood up. Her legs felt strange, like she had borrowed them from another woman. "I'm sorry," she said. "I have to leave. You haven't checked in yet." "I know. I'm sorry. I have to leave." She walked out of the dentist's office holding the magazine. She walked across the parking lot. She got into her car. She sat in the driver's seat. She did not start the engine. She looked at the photograph again. The wedding was scheduled for the second Saturday in November. The location was the Ashford family compound in East Hampton. The reception, the magazine said, would feature a string quartet, 400 guests, and a custom floral installation by a designer flown in from London. Maggie was a florist. She thought, with a kind of distant, hysterical clarity, I could have done his wedding flowers. Then she put her forehead on the steering wheel. She stayed there for a long time. She drove home. She did not remember driving home. She sat in her own driveway for an hour. Her apartment was on the second floor of a small house owned by a retired teacher named Mrs. Petrov, who kept a vegetable garden in the back and always brought Maggie tomatoes in August. Maggie watched a squirrel run along the telephone wire above her car 3 times, back and forth, back and forth. Inside her apartment, on the mantel, there was a framed photograph of Daniel Cross. He was smiling, 29 years old, standing in front of a lighthouse in Maine, the wind in his hair, a sailing rope coiled at his feet. Beside the photograph was a small silver urn. Patricia, his mother, had given her the urn 6 months after the memorial. I had them cremate his hairbrush, sweetheart, his razor, his old sailing gloves. I thought you should have something. Maggie had wept. She had held the urn against her chest. She had thanked Patricia again and again for being so thoughtful. She walked into her apartment. She did not take off her coat. She walked to the mantel. She picked up the urn. It was lighter than she remembered. Of course it was lighter. There was nothing in it that had ever been a person. She set it back down, carefully, like it might break, like she might break. She picked up her phone. She called Tess. Hey, Tess said. Aren't you supposed to be at the dentist? Tess, I need you to come over. Are you okay? No. Are you hurt? No. Maggie. What? Maggie looked at the photograph of Daniel on the mantel, the young man with the wind in his hair. Tess, I think I'm losing my mind. I think I just saw my dead fiancé on the cover of a magazine. He's getting married to a billionaire's daughter in 3 weeks. Silence on the other end of the line. Then Tess said, I'm getting in the car. Don't do anything until I get there. What would I do? I don't know. Don't do it. Tess arrived in 40 minutes. She still had her work badge clipped to her shirt. She worked at a pharmaceutical company. She had skipped a meeting. She walked in without knocking. Maggie was sitting at her small kitchen table. The magazine was open in front of her. Tess sat down. Tess picked up the magazine. She looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she said one word. Sweetie? She did not say it's not him. She did not say you're imagining things. She said sweetie, the way you said it to someone whose world was ending, because she could see it too. Tess opened her laptop. She typed Daniel Whitfield hedge fund into the search bar. A Wikipedia page came up. There was a photograph, a clean professional headshot, the same face, the same scar, the same crooked smile. The page said Daniel Whitfield was 41 years old. Daniel Cross would have been 41 years old. The page said he had founded his company 6.5 years ago. The memorial for Daniel Cross had been held 7 years ago, last June. There was, on the Wikipedia page, a link to a short biography on his company's website. The biography began 6.5 years ago. Before that, nothing. He waited, Tess said. Her voice was very quiet. 6 months after they buried his empty coffin. Then he became a real person again. Maggie ran to the bathroom. She threw up. Tess held her hair back without saying anything. When Maggie came back to the kitchen, Tess had poured her a glass of water. She had also poured herself a glass of wine. It was 3:30 in the afternoon. I'm not driving home tonight, Tess said. I'm staying. We're getting through this together. Maggie sat down. She picked up the water. Her hands were shaking. She looked at her best friend. She looked at the magazine. She looked at the silver urn on the mantel. Through the open kitchen door, 7 years. She had cried at his grave on every November 14th. She had kept his old sweater in a vacuum-sealed bag because she was afraid of losing his smell. She had refused 2 perfectly good men because she still felt married to a ghost. And he had been somewhere, drinking champagne, marrying women, building hedge funds. He had been alive. He had let her grieve. Maggie set the glass of water down. She looked at Tess. "I'm not crazy," she said. "I know what I saw." It was the first declarative sentence she had said in 7 years that did not begin with the word maybe. Tess stayed the night. They drank wine. They opened the magazine 50 times. They opened the laptop more. By 11 o'clock, the small kitchen table was covered in printed photographs. Daniel Whitfield at a charity gala. Daniel Whitfield buying coffee in Tribeca. Daniel Whitfield standing on the steps of the Met, kissing Vivian Ashford on the cheek. Maggie put the photographs next to old photographs of Daniel Cross. She measured the scar with a ruler. She mapped the smile. She zoomed in on the hands. The left thumbnail, the one he had slammed in a car door at 26. The nail had grown back crooked, with a small ridge running down the center. A tiny imperfection, the kind of thing only a woman who had loved a man would notice. Daniel Whitfield's left thumbnail had a ridge running down the center. Maggie set down the magnifying glass. "It's him. I know. I'm not crazy. I know. Tess, he's alive. I know, sweetie." They sat in the quiet kitchen. The refrigerator hummed. A car drove past outside, its headlights sweeping across the wall. "Why?" Maggie said. The word came out flat. Why would he do this? Tess was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know yet," she said. "But we're going to find out." The next morning, Maggie called Patricia Cross. Patricia lived in a retirement community in Sarasota now. She had moved there 3 years after the memorial. "I need warmth, sweetheart. The cold reminds me of him." Maggie used to call her every month. They had cried together. They had shared recipes. They had sent each other birthday cards. Patricia had stopped answering. Slowly, gradually, and Maggie, eventually, had stopped calling. The phone rang 4 times. "Hello?" Patricia's voice, familiar, warm, the voice of a woman Maggie had loved like a second mother. "Patricia, it's Maggie." A pause, a long one. "Margaret, sweetheart, how are you?" The voice was tight. Wrong. There was a television playing in the background. It went abruptly silent, as if she had picked up a remote and muted it. "Patricia, I saw a magazine yesterday." The pause this time was even longer. Then Patricia said, "I have to go, dear." She hung up. Maggie stared at her phone. She called back. The phone went to voicemail. She called again. Voicemail. She called a 4th time. Voicemail. Tess came into the kitchen wearing one of Maggie's robes, holding a mug of coffee. What happened? She knew. Tess set down the coffee. "What?" "Patricia, she knew. The whole time. She hung up on me." Tess sat down slowly. "Oh my God." Maggie looked at her phone. 7 years of monthly phone calls. 7 years of birthday cards. 7 years of crying together at the cemetery. "She held me," Maggie said. The words came out hollow. "On the day of the memorial, she held me and we cried, and she knew there was nothing in that coffin." Maggie. She knew, Tess. Maggie sat down at the kitchen table. She did not cry. The tears were behind her eyes, but they did not come. She felt, instead, a cold, clear thing settling in her chest. A sharp thing. The kind of thing that, once it was inside you, would not leave. She had spent 7 years grieving a man who was not dead. In a small condominium In Florida, his mother had been performing alongside her. She drove to the police station that afternoon. The officer at the front desk was very young, 23 at the most. He had a kind face and a pin with a chewed cap. Maggie told him her story. She tried to keep her voice level. She tried not to sound unwell. She failed. The officer nodded. He took notes. He said, in the tone of voice people used when they thought you were a sweet, slightly broken older woman, "Ma'am, we'll look into it." He did not call her back. She knew he was not going to call her back. She drove home. She sat at her kitchen table. She opened her laptop. She typed 3 words into the search bar, how to investigate. Then she stopped. She closed the laptop. She picked up her phone. She called Tess again. "Tess, the cops aren't going to help me. I figured. I need someone who will. Hold on. Let me make a call. My husband knows somebody." Detective Raymond Sullivan was a big man, mid-50s. He had been retired from the New Haven police force for 2 years. He took occasional private cases for friends of friends. He met Maggie at a diner in Bridgeport. He ordered eggs. He ate them slowly. He did not interrupt her. When she finished her story, he set down his fork. "Ma'am, I want you to understand something. What you're describing, fake death, identity reinvention, it's rare. It's rarer than people think, but it happens. And when it happens, there is almost always money involved." Maggie sipped her coffee. It had gone cold, bitter, like everything else that morning. "Tell me what you remember about the death," he said. "Not what you remember feeling, what you remember about the facts." Maggie thought. He was on a sailing trip by himself. He was supposed to be gone 3 days. The boat was found capsized off the coast of Maine on the 2nd day. They searched for 11 days. They didn't find a body. Who reported the boat? A fisherman. Patricia got the call. Was there life insurance? Yes. How much? $250,000. Who was the beneficiary? Maggie blinked. "Patricia," she said. Patricia was the beneficiary. He had named her before he met me. He was going to change it. After the wedding. Sullivan nodded slowly. "And you? Were you on the policy at all?" "No." "Did he have other debts? Financial troubles?" Maggie thought back. There had been one strange conversation. She had almost forgotten. 6 months before he died, he had come home late one night, shaken. He had told her he had run into an old friend from college. "A guy I used to gamble with. He's in a bad way. I'm going to help him out." She had not thought about it again. She told Sullivan. Sullivan wrote it down. "Ma'am, I'm taking your case. I'm not going to charge you much. My daughter went through something. Not the same thing. Something." He did not elaborate. "Within 48 hours, he said, I will tell you what your fiancé did with his life after he died." Sullivan was as good as his word. He called her on Friday morning. She was in her apartment, drinking coffee, watering her plants. She had not been to work in 3 days. Her assistant, a sweet young woman named Rebecca, was managing the shop. "Miss Halloran, Hassan?" "Yes." "Are you sitting down?" "Yes." "The Coast Guard report on the boat is thin, suspiciously thin. The rescue effort was shorter than it should have been. The boat was reported by a fisherman who, when I tracked him down, turned out to be a college friend of your fiancé's, the same friend, I'm guessing, that he mentioned the gambling debts about." Maggie set down her coffee. "Sullivan, there's more. Patricia Cross had her son declared legally dead at the earliest possible moment under Maine law, 1 year and 1 day. She collected the insurance. 6 months later, a man named Daniel Whitfield purchased a small apartment in Lower Manhattan with cash. He had a Social Security number tied to a man named Daniel Whitfield who had died in infancy in Iowa in 1983. Maggie closed her eyes. "Ma'am, your fiancé didn't fake his death by accident. He had help. The help was his mother. The motive was, very likely, gambling debts that would have gotten him hurt. He didn't tell me. No, ma'am, he didn't. He let me bury an empty coffin. Yes, ma'am. There was a long silence. Maggie looked at her plants, the aloe, the pothos, the small jade tree she had bought on her 30th birthday. Living things, things she had kept alive, while she had been mourning a man who had been very much alive. She walked to the mantel. She picked up the silver urn. She opened it. She poured the contents into the kitchen sink. The ashes were gray, powdery, nothing. She turned on the water. They washed away. You weren't real, she said to the empty kitchen. But my grief was. She went back to work on Monday. She had to. Rebecca could not run the shop forever. There was a wedding on Saturday. A young couple, both school teachers. The bride wanted ranunculus and white roses. Maggie had promised them a discount because the bride had cried on the phone about her budget. Maggie unlocked the shop at 7 in the morning. She turned on the lights. She started the coffee. She did the things she had done for 14 years. She walked into the cooler. The cold air hit her face. The smell hit her, eucalyptus and wet stems, and that faint, green, living smell of cut flowers. And then it came, the flooding. She sat down on the cold cement floor of the cooler. She remembered. She remembered Daniel proposing on a beach in Cape Cod. She had been wearing a yellow sundress. He had gotten down on one knee in the sand, and the wave had come up and soaked his pants, and they had laughed so hard she had cried. She remembered him meeting her mother for the first time. Eleanor had cooked a roast. He had complimented the gravy 3 times. Eleanor had pulled Maggie aside in the kitchen and said, "He's nice, honey. He's a little too nice." Maggie had been annoyed at her mother. "Mom, stop." She remembered him teaching her to drive stick shift in the parking lot of an empty grocery store. She had stalled the car 11 times. He had not lost patience. He had said, "Hey, look at me. You're going to get it. You're going to get it." She remembered him crying at his father's funeral. Real tears, real shaking shoulders. She had held him, and she had thought, he loves so deeply. He feels things so deeply. She remembered him as their last morning together, the morning he had left for the sailing trip. He had kissed her forehead. He had said, "I love you, Margaret. Don't ever forget that." She remembered, now, the way he had said it, the weight of it, the strange formality. She had thought, at the time, it was sweet. It had been a goodbye. He had known he wasn't coming back. He had said the words like a man closing a door. Maggie sat on the cold floor of the cooler. The flowers around her were beautiful. The flowers around her had nothing to do with what was happening inside her. She put her hands flat on the cement floor. She breathed in, she breathed out. God, I was so stupid. The signs were all there. She said it out loud. I was so stupid. The signs were all there. It was not true. She knew, even as she said it, that it was not true. She had not been stupid. She had been loved by a professional liar. There was no version of her younger self that would have caught it. He had been good at it. He had practiced. But the flooding kept coming. She remembered him being strange about meeting her cousins. She remembered him refusing to go to her college reunion. She remembered him asking her, casually, 6 months before he died, whether she had ever updated her will. "You should, sweetheart. Just in case. Just in case." He had been planning his exit. He had been making sure that, when he disappeared, the legal pieces would fall in his favor. She got up off the floor. She did the work that had to be done. She cut stems. She conditioned roses. She wrote a delivery list. She trained Rebecca on a new technique for spiral bouquets. She was crying the whole time. Rebecca did not say anything. Rebecca was 26. She had been raised right. She brought Maggie a tissue. She brought Maggie another tissue. She did not ask. At the end of the day, when Rebecca was leaving, she stopped at the door. "Maggie, whatever it is, you're going to be okay." Maggie nodded. She did not know if it was true, but she nodded. That night, Eleanor showed up at her apartment. Eleanor was 67. She wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She drove a Buick. She had a casserole in her hands and a blue duffel bag over her shoulder. "Mom, Tess called me. Don't be mad. Move." Eleanor walked past her into the apartment. She set the casserole on the counter. She set the duffel bag on the floor. She turned around. Maggie expected her mother to say something sharp, something cutting, something that would cost her energy to absorb. Eleanor walked across the kitchen. Eleanor put her arms around her daughter. Eleanor held her. Maggie cried then, not the polite tears of the day, the other kind, the kind that came from somewhere deep, somewhere that had been locked, somewhere that needed to be opened with a particular key. Eleanor's perfume was the same one she had worn since 1987. White linen. It smelled like Maggie's whole childhood. After a long time, Eleanor pulled back. She looked at her daughter's face. She wiped a tear from her cheek with her thumb. "Margaret." "Yes, Mom?" "I never liked him." Maggie laughed, a wet, broken laugh. "Mom, you sent him a Christmas card every year for 3 years after he died." "Yes," Eleanor said. "I always felt strange about it, like I was sending it to someone who was reading it. I never said anything because I thought I was being a paranoid old woman." She paused. "Sweetheart, I'm sorry I did not say anything." It was the first apology Eleanor had given anyone in 15 years. Maggie remembered it the rest of her life. Eleanor heated up the casserole. They ate it standing up at the counter. It was chicken and rice and a strange sauce Eleanor had been making since Maggie was 8. Maggie ate 2 helpings. She had not eaten properly in 4 days. After dinner, Eleanor sat down on the couch. She patted the cushion beside her. Maggie sat down. Eleanor turned on the television. "Murder," she wrote. Episode 40-something. Jessica Fletcher, solving a murder at a country inn. They watched 2 episodes. Maggie fell asleep with her head on her mother's shoulder. She slept 5 hours, the longest stretch in a week. The next day, Sullivan called. "Ma'am, I have something." "You're going to want to sit down." She sat down. "There's a society reporter in the Hamptons. Vivian Ashford has a stepmother. The stepmother does not love Vivian. The stepmother loves Vivian's father. She doesn't trust your fiancé. She has been trying to break up the engagement for 6 months, with no luck." "What's her name?" "Marguerite Ashford, age 54, former model. Married Charles Ashford 8 years ago. She doesn't drink coffee. She drinks Pinot Grigio at 2 in the afternoon. She might talk to you." Maggie wrote down the name. "How do I reach her?" "I have her cell. But ma'am, I want you to think carefully. Once you contact her, this gets bigger than just you. There are billionaires involved. There's a family reputation. There's a wedding industry already in motion. Florists, caterers, press. You step into this, you can't step out." Maggie looked at the photograph of Daniel on the mantel. She had not taken it down yet. She was not sure why. She picked it up. She walked to the kitchen trash can. She dropped the photograph into the bag, frame and all. The glass cracked when it hit the bottom. She walked back to the phone. "Sullivan, give me her number. I am not stepping out." Marguerite Ashford did not answer her phone. She answered her texts. Maggie sent a long one. 3 paragraphs. Calm, specific. Photographs attached. Patricia's deposition would not exist for 2 more weeks. But the side-by-side images of Daniel Cross and Daniel Whitfield were enough. Marguerite responded in 14 minutes. "Drive to the Hamptons. There's a wine bar in Sag Harbor called The Anchor. Tomorrow at 2. Wear something gray. Maggie did not ask why gray. She drove. Eleanor drove with her. It was a long drive. 5 hours. October. The leaves on the parkway were the color of old copper. The car smelled like Eleanor's coffee and the sandwiches she had packed. The radio played a station Eleanor liked. Songs from 1976. The kind of songs that sounded, even now, like a younger woman might come into the room any moment and sing along. Maggie thought about her younger self, the 31-year-old florist who had buried her fiancé's empty coffin, who had stood at the graveside in a black wool dress that did not fit because she had stopped eating, who had thanked everyone for coming, who had whispered to Patricia, "Thank you for being here. I don't know how I would do this without you." Patricia had whispered back, "We have each other now, sweetheart." He would have wanted that. Maggie pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the passenger window. Some lies were so big you couldn't see the edges of them. You stood inside them for years and called the inside your life. "Mom." "Yes?" Did you ever think it was strange that his mother knew so much about his finances, the insurance, the accounts? Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I did. But people grieve in different ways. Some women bury themselves in paperwork. Yet I thought she was that kind of woman." "She was that kind of woman," Maggie said. "Just not for the reason I thought." They stopped at a rest stop outside New Haven. Eleanor went to the bathroom. Maggie sat in the parked car. She did not get out. She watched a man in a green jacket walk a small white dog across the parking lot. She watched a family of 4 eat sandwiches at a picnic table. She watched a teenage girl cry into her phone, leaning against a vending machine, sitting in the parked car, unable to go inside. It was such a small, specific thing. The thing women did when their lives were too big to walk into. Maggie had done it 100 times in 7 years. After she had cleaned out his closet, after she had told her therapist she was ready to date again, then realized at the last minute she was not, after she had attended Tess's daughter's first birthday and watched the other women her age bouncing babies on their hips. She had sat in the parked car. She had not gone inside. She was not going to do it today. She got out of the car. She walked into the rest stop. She bought herself a coffee and a chocolate bar. She came back to the car. Eleanor was already there. "You all right, sweetheart?" "I'm getting there, Mom. I'm getting there." Marguerite Ashford was the most elegant woman Maggie had ever seen in person. She was 54. Her hair was the color of expensive champagne. She wore pearls, 3 strands. She wore them like a woman who knew exactly what they cost and how to fight in them. She was 3 glasses of Pinot deep when Maggie walked into the Anchor. The wine bar was almost empty. October on a Tuesday afternoon. The light came through the front windows in long, slanted gold. Marguerite looked Maggie up and down. "Sit." Maggie sat. "You wore gray. Good. You look like a woman who works for a living. That helps." "I do work for a living." "I know. I looked you up. Florist, Connecticut. Small business, nice website." She slid a glass across the table. White wine. Maggie did not love white wine. She drank it anyway. "Tell me everything," Marguerite said. "Don't leave anything out. I have spent the last 6 months being told I am a paranoid, jealous stepmother. I would like to know if I am right." Maggie told her everything. Marguerite listened. She did not interrupt. When Maggie finished, Marguerite signaled for another glass of wine. She drank half of it. She set it down. She looked at Maggie with eyes that were suddenly very sharp. "He looks at her," Marguerite said, "like she's a building he's about to buy." Maggie's stomach went cold. Vivienne is a kind girl. She is also a lonely girl. Her mother died when she was 12. Her father is a workaholic. She has spent her entire adult life worried that men want her for her money. He has spent the last 2 years convincing her he doesn't. He's good at that. Yes, I can see now that he is. I have tried to warn her. She accuses me of jealousy. She accuses me of wanting to keep her father to myself. There is, I will admit, a small amount of truth in that. But the larger truth is that I know men. I have been married 3 times. The third one is the right one. The first 2 were practice. I know what it looks like when a man is studying a woman like a target. Marguerite leaned forward. You don't crash this wedding. I don't? No. You let me crash it. You give me your file, the detective, the photos, the social security record, the deposition when you have it. You give me ammunition, I will use it. Why? Marguerite smiled. It was not a nice smile. It was the smile of a woman who had been called paranoid for 6 months and had now been handed a folder of evidence. Because, she said, I love that girl like she is my own, and because I would like, very much, to be right. That night, alone in the inn, Maggie did the thing she did when she was overwhelmed. She pulled out her grandmother's recipe box. Her grandmother had been a small, Irish woman from Hartford who had baked bread every Sunday until she was 86. The recipe box had come to Maggie when her grandmother died. It was wooden, painted blue, full of index cards, covered in spidery, beautiful handwriting. Maggie carried it everywhere, to work conferences, to weddings, to the inn in the Hamptons. She sat on the bed, she opened the box, she organized the cards. She did this for 40 minutes. Eleanor watched her from the other bed, reading a paperback. Sweetheart. Yes, Mom. Your grandmother used to say something, when she was your age. She used to say, the Lord gives you bad weather and good weather. The trick is to know which is which, and to dress accordingly. Maggie laughed. What does that mean, Mom? It means, Eleanor said, that you are dressed appropriately for what is coming. You wore gray today. Tomorrow, you will wear something else. You are a woman who knows how to dress for weather. Maggie closed the recipe box. She set it on the bedside table. She turned off the light. She slept. 3 days later, Marguerite called. The folder is good. It's better than good. There is one thing missing. What? The mother's deposition. Get it. Then we are ready. Maggie called Sullivan. Sullivan called the FBI. The FBI called Patricia Cross. Patricia Cross, 64 years old, widow, living alone in a retirement community in Sarasota, opened her front door to 2 federal agents on a Wednesday morning at 11:30. She started crying before they finished introducing themselves. She told them everything. She told them about Daniel's gambling debts. She told them about the small business his uncle had run in New Hampshire and the money laundering she had not realized was money laundering until it was too late. She told them about the night Daniel had come to her, crying, 3 months before the sailing trip, and had said, Mom, they're going to kill me. I have to disappear. She told them about the fisherman friend. She told them about the boat. She told them about the bank account in the Caymans. She told them about every birthday card, every Christmas, every cemetery visit with Margaret Halloran. She told them about the way Maggie had cried on her shoulder. She told them about the way she had patted Maggie's back and said, he would be so glad you came today. The FBI agents took notes for 4 hours. They did not arrest her. They were going to use her. She signed everything they put in front of her. She gave them the bank records. She gave them the names. She gave them the dates. She gave them, finally, her son. When they left, she sat on her floral couch. She turned on the television. She watched a game show. She did not register anything that happened on the screen. She had not heard from Daniel in 6 weeks. He had not called her about the engagement. He had not invited her to the wedding. She had not been invited to a single thing in his new life. She had been waiting for 7 years for him to bring her into the second life. Now she understood. He had never been going to. She had been a tool he had used to escape. The moment she was no longer useful, she had been left behind, like the empty coffin she had stood beside. While another woman wept on her shoulder, she picked up the phone. She dialed Maggie's number. Her hands were shaking. Maggie answered on the second ring. Patricia? Margaret, I am so sorry. Patricia could not say anything else. She cried for a full minute. Maggie did not interrupt. She listened to a 64-year-old woman cry into the phone. When Patricia could speak again, she said, I will testify. I will say everything. I will say it in court. I will say it to your mother. I will say it to anyone who will listen. I am so sorry, Margaret. I lost my husband. I was afraid to lose my son. I let him use that fear. I will live with this for the rest of my life. Maggie was quiet for a long time. And then she said, Patricia, I am not ready to forgive you, but I want you to know that I hear you. It was the most generous thing she had ever said. It was more than Patricia deserved. It was, Maggie realized after she hung up, what she needed to say to free herself. Marguerite invited Maggie to the rehearsal dinner, not as Margaret Halloran, as Margaret H., an old college friend visiting from Connecticut. Charles Ashford did not love it. Charles was busy. Charles trusted Vivian to handle small social details. Vivian, when Maggie was introduced to her in the foyer of the Ashford compound on a cool Friday evening, smiled warmly. Marguerite says you're a florist. I am. Did you do the centerpieces? They're beautiful. I didn't, but thank you. Vivienne was 29. She was wearing a pale blue dress. She had her mother's eyes. Maggie had seen the photographs in the magazine. She had the slightly anxious bearing of a woman who had grown up wealthy and had spent her life worried that no one would love her for herself. She was, Maggie realized with a small, sad shock, a perfect target for Daniel. She was kind. She was lonely. She was rich. She was in another universe. Maggie at 31. Daniel walked into the foyer. He was shaking hands with Charles's business partner. He was laughing at something. He turned. He saw Maggie. He went white. It was not a metaphor. The blood actually left his face. His mouth opened slightly. His hand, which had been on the other man's shoulder, dropped. The whole room did not notice. The whole room was wealthy and well-dressed and slightly drunk on champagne. The whole room was talking about a new restaurant in Manhattan. Vivian noticed. Vivian was not a stupid woman. She had spent her whole life noticing the moment when people saw her father and recalibrated. She knew the look. She knew it intimately. She had just seen her fiancé recalibrate. Daniel recovered. He smiled. He walked across the foyer. He extended his hand. Daniel Whitfield. Lovely to meet you. His voice was perfectly even. Maggie took his hand. His palm was sweating. Margaret Halloran, she said. Lovely to meet you. Daniel. She emphasized the name just slightly. He heard it. Vivian heard it. Maggie did not let go of his hand for 2 seconds longer than was polite. She looked into his eyes. She did not blink. He blinked first. She let go of his hand. She turned to Vivian. You have a beautiful home. The light is wonderful. I'm a florist. I notice these things. Thank you. How did you two meet? The question was casual, the kind of question a stranger asked at a rehearsal dinner. Daniel started to answer. Vivian talked over him. She had not done this before. Maggie could tell by the way Daniel froze. At a charity event 2 years ago, he was very persistent. He didn't take no for an answer. That's romantic, Maggie said. Some men are like that. They see what they want and they pursue it. Vivian looked at her. Vivian was very still. Marguerite, across the room, was watching them like a hawk. "Daniel," Maggie said. "You look familiar. Have we met before? You remind me of someone I used to know." He did not answer. "It's the scar," Maggie said. "Above your eyebrow. The man I knew had one just like it. Funny, isn't it?" She smiled, she turned, she walked away. She walked across the foyer. She walked into the powder room. She locked the door. She put her hands on the marble counter. She looked at herself in the mirror. Her hands were not shaking. Her face was calm. "I deserved better than this," she said to the woman in the mirror. The woman in the mirror nodded. She walked back out. Later, she would remember the rest of the evening in fragments. The sound of Vivian's voice, quiet and tight, asking Daniel where he had grown up. The sound of his voice, less smooth than usual, saying Iowa. A small town. You wouldn't have heard of it. The sound of Marguerite's heels crossing the marble floor. The sound of a side door clicking shut. The sound of Vivian and Daniel speaking, very quietly, behind that door. The sound of 40 minutes of silence. The sound of the door opening. The sound of Vivian walking past her father, leaning down, whispering into his ear. The sound of Charles Ashford's wine glass being set down on a side table. Very carefully, the sound of Charles Ashford saying, in a voice that was both tired and final, "Get him out of my house." There was no public scene. The Ashford family did not do public scenes. Daniel was escorted off the property by 2 security guards. He was given a suitcase, a check for $10,000, and a non-disclosure agreement. He signed it. He did not read it. He left in a town car at 11:30 at night. The town car drove him to a small hotel in East Hampton. He sat in the back seat. He did not cry. He looked out the window at the dark trees. The wedding was canceled the next morning by a press release. Mutual decision. Wishing each other the best. A polite, civilized lie. The truth, Marguerite told Maggie, would unfold more slowly. Marguerite had already leaked the file. Not to a tabloid. To Sullivan, who had already been speaking to the FBI. The FBI had already been preparing the case. The press release was just a curtain to give Charles Ashford and his family one last weekend of dignity before the storm. The storm came on a Wednesday. A small article in the New York Times, page B6, hedge fund manager Daniel Whitfield under investigation for identity fraud. The article was short. The article was devastating. It mentioned a previous identity. It mentioned a death certificate. It mentioned a fiancé from a previous life who had grieved him for 7 years. It did not name Maggie. Sullivan had made sure of that. Maggie read the article on her phone, sitting in her shop in New Haven, wearing her green florist apron, surrounded by buckets of dahlias. She was preparing for a Saturday wedding. Rebecca read it over her shoulder. "Maggie." "Yes." "Is this you?" Maggie set down the phone. "Yes, Rebecca. It's me." Rebecca did not say anything for a moment. Then Rebecca hugged her. Rebecca was not a hugger. It was a strange, awkward, brief hug. It meant everything. "I'm going to make us coffee," Rebecca said. "Then we are going to do these dahlias. And then we are going to close early, and you are going to go home." Maggie nodded. She did the dahlias. She closed early. She went home. The doorbell rang at 7:30. Maggie opened it. Vivian Ashford was standing on her front step. She was wearing jeans, a camel coat, no makeup. She had driven herself in a small black BMW. Maggie had not heard pull up. "I'm sorry to come without warning," Vivian said. "I can leave." "Come in." Maggie made tea. She did not ask how Vivian had gotten her address. Marguerite, probably, or her father's people. They sat at the small kitchen table, the same table where Maggie had sat with Tess on the night of the magazine. The same table where Eleanor had set down the casserole. "I want to apologize," Vivian said. "You didn't do anything. I almost married him. I would have given him my name, my family's money. My future children would have been his children. I was 13 days from making him real again in a new way, from letting him cement what he had built on top of you." "You didn't know." "No, but I should have. There were things, small things. He never spoke about his mother. He never wanted to go to Maine. There was a song on the radio one time, an old Eagles song, and he changed the station like it had bitten him. I asked, he laughed. He said it was a song an ex-girlfriend used to play. I let it go. I let so many things go." Maggie reached across the table. She took Vivian's hand. "Listen to me. He is very, very good at this. He has practiced. You are not stupid for being deceived by a professional. You are kind. You are trusting. Those are not flaws. Those are the things he targeted because he wanted them." Vivian's eyes filled. "I am 34 years old," she said. "I have spent every single day of my adult life worried that no one would want me for me. I was so happy, Margaret. I was so happy that I had finally found someone who saw past it." "He didn't see past it. He used it." I know that now." They sat in silence. The tea cooled in their cups. Then Vivian reached into her bag. She took out a small velvet box. She set it on the table. "This was the engagement ring he gave me. I had it appraised when I was buying him a wedding gift. A watch I thought he would like. The jeweler who appraised the watch said the central diamond in my ring was older than the setting. He said it had been reset. About 7 years ago, he estimated. I always thought that was strange. I never asked Daniel about it." Maggie's stomach went cold. "Vivian, what did the diamond look like?" "A round cut, old, about 1.5 carats. The sides are slightly uneven, the way the old ones were before machine cutting got perfect. There is a small inclusion near the bottom that looks like a tiny letter G." Maggie stood up. She walked to her bedroom. She came back with a photograph, black and white. Her grandmother, age 23, in a wedding dress in 1953. Her grandmother's left hand was holding a small bouquet. On the third finger, a ring, a round diamond, slightly uneven, with a tiny inclusion that looked like a letter G. Vivian looked at the photograph. Vivian looked at the velvet box on the table. Vivian pushed the box across the table. "It's yours." Maggie opened the box. She looked at her grandmother's diamond. She looked at the new setting. Modern, platinum, cold. She closed the box. "I'll have the original setting recreated," she said. "From this photograph. Will you wear it again? Not as an engagement ring, as my grandmother's ring, the way it was meant to be worn." Vivian nodded. She drank her cold tea. "Margaret, I would like to ask you a question. You don't have to answer. Ask. How long does it take to stop feeling like a fool?" Maggie thought about it. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I'll let you know when I get there. But I will tell you this. Foolishness is a feeling. It is not a fact. The fact is that you loved someone. The fact is that he lied. Loving someone is not foolish. Lying is." Vivian started to cry, quietly. Maggie got up. She walked around the table. She put her hand on Vivian's shoulder. "You are going to be all right. You are going to be more than all right. You are going to be free." Vivian stayed for 2 hours. When she left, Maggie stood at the front door watching the small black BMW pull away. The sky was dark. The street lights had come on. A neighbor was walking her dog. The dog stopped to sniff a fire hydrant. Maggie closed the door. She walked to the kitchen. She picked up the velvet box. She opened it. She looked at her grandmother's diamond. 7 years ago, on a Tuesday evening, Daniel Cross had taken this ring out of her grandmother's jewelry box, where it had lived for 30 years, and he had put it in his pocket. He had taken it with him when he disappeared. He had kept it for 6 months in a safe deposit box. Then he had taken it to a jeweler in Manhattan. He had asked for a new setting. He had used the diamond 2 years ago to propose to a billionaire's daughter. Maggie sat down at the kitchen table. She did not cry. She placed her right hand flat on the table. She placed the open velvet box on top of her hand. She felt the weight of it. A diamond was just a stone. A stone was just compressed carbon. The grandmother who had worn this stone first had been a real person. The love between her grandparents had been real. The marriage had been real. The 54 years they had shared had been real. The diamond had been borrowed by a liar. It was home now. She closed the box. She put it in her bag. She walked to her bedroom. She lay down on her bed in her clothes. She stared at the ceiling. She had not turned the light off. She did not turn it off for a long time. The hardest part, she thought, was admitting she had known all along. There had been a small voice, for 7 years, a small voice she had silenced because it had seemed impossible. A small voice that had said, every November 14th, something doesn't add up. She had not been crazy. She had been, all along, paying attention. She had just refused to let herself hear it. The case made the news for 2 more weeks. Then a celebrity got divorced, and another man invented a cryptocurrency scandal, and the world moved on, the way the world always did. Maggie did not move on at the same speed. The news cycle was 3 weeks. The actual processing was longer. She started waking up at 3 in the morning, the same time every night. 3:11, 3:12. She would lie in the dark and think about the 7 years. She would think about the November 14ths. She would think about her 32nd birthday, which she had spent alone in her apartment because she had not been ready to celebrate without him. Her 33rd, her 34th, her 35th, 5 birthdays, eaten by a man who had been somewhere drinking champagne. She would lie in the dark and her chest would feel tight. The tightness would crawl up her throat. She would get up. She would walk to the kitchen. She would pour herself a glass of water. She would stand at the kitchen window and watch the dark street. One night, around the 18th of November, she sat on the bathroom floor in the dark. She did not turn on the light. The tile was cold under her thighs. She was wearing one of Daniel's old t-shirts. She had kept 3 of them. She had not been able to throw them out, even after the news broke. They were just shirts. The shirts had not lied to her. The shirts had been with her on Saturday mornings, on lazy Sunday afternoons, on the day they had picked out paint colors for their first apartment together. She held the t-shirt to her face. It did not smell like him anymore. It smelled like her laundry detergent. It smelled like her closet. It smelled like 7 years of being something else. She sat on the bathroom floor. The radiator clanked. A cat yowled somewhere in the alley behind the house. A truck rumbled past on the street. She thought about the woman she had been at 31. That woman had stood at a graveside in a black wool dress that had been too big because she had not eaten in 2 weeks. That woman had been thanked by Patricia for being so brave. That woman had whispered, "I will love him for the rest of my life." That woman had meant it. Maggie put her face in her hands. I lost 7 years of being someone. I lost 7 years of laughing. I lost 7 years of waking up next to a person who actually loved me. I lost 7 years of dating, of meeting someone new, of having a child, of buying a house, of all the things people do when they are alive. He took those years from me. He gave them to a billionaire's daughter. She cried then, hard, the kind of crying that made her ribs hurt. She cried for a long time. When the crying stopped, she stayed on the bathroom floor. She thought about her 38-year-old self. She had a small business. She had a mother who loved her. She had a best friend who had stayed the night when her world was ending. She had a grandmother's diamond in a velvet box on her dresser. She had a body that was healthy. She had a mind that even after 7 years of silencing itself, had still seen the truth on a magazine cover and known. She still had time. She did not know how much. No one did. But she had some. She thought about the women who didn't. She thought about her grandmother, who had been buried at 86, who had not regretted a single year of her marriage because her marriage had been real. She thought about her Aunt Teresa, who had died at 51 of breast cancer, who had spent the last 6 months of her life saying, "I should have taken that trip to Paris when I had the chance." She thought about Tess's mother-in-law, who had been a brilliant lawyer and who, at 60, had developed early-onset Alzheimer's and now did not remember her own name. Time was the only thing. It was the only thing. Maggie stood up. She walked into her bedroom. She turned on the light. She opened her closet. She took out Daniel's 3 t-shirts. She walked to the kitchen. She put them in a paper grocery bag. She walked outside in her pajamas in November at 4 in the morning. She walked to the dumpster behind Mrs. Petrov's house. She lifted the heavy plastic lid. She dropped the bag inside. She walked back to her apartment. She sat on the couch. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. She watched the sun come up through her front window. It came up slowly, gray, then pink, then gold. She watched the whole thing. She did not look at her phone. She did not check her email. She did not turn on the news. She watched a sunrise, a real one, with her own eyes, for the first time in 7 years. When the sun was up, she made herself coffee. She made herself eggs. She sat at the kitchen table and she ate them. The coffee was good. The eggs were good. She was hungry. She had not been hungry, in any real sense, for a long time. She finished the eggs. She washed the plate. She went to take a shower. The hot water hit her shoulders. She closed her eyes. Starting over feels impossible. Staying still feels worse. She said it out loud, into the steam. It came out as a fact, not a question. A fact. She was starting over. She started small. Therapy twice a month. A woman named Dr. Lynn had been recommended by Tess. Maggie had been resistant at first, then she had gone. Dr. Lynn was 60 years old and quiet and asked questions Maggie did not always know how to answer. Yoga, once a week. Maggie was bad at it. She fell over during tree pose. The teacher, a young woman named Joanne, who turned out to be the same Joanne who would later come work in her shop, told her that falling over was not a failure. It just means you are paying attention to your body. The bodies that are paying attention sometimes fall. Walking. Every morning before work, 40 minutes, a loop around her neighborhood. She started in November, when it was cold. She kept going through January, when it was colder. By February, she had her route memorized. The Petrov house, the blue mailbox, the corner where the dog with the bandana lived, the yellow house where the man practiced piano in the front window. 3 turns, home. She started cooking again. Real cooking. Not the heat-and-eat dinners she had been living on. She pulled out her grandmother's recipe box. She made the chicken and rice and the strange sauce. She made her grandmother's bread. She made apple pie. She invited Tess and Tess's husband and Lily over for Sunday dinner in February. And Lily, 12 years old, with new braces and an opinion about everything, ate 3 slices of pie and announced that Aunt Maggie was a better cook than her mother. Tess pretended to be insulted. Maggie laughed. She laughed easily now. The laugh came up from her chest, not from her throat. In March, Sullivan called her about the case. He took a plea deal, Sullivan said. 4 years, federal, wire fraud, identity theft, Social Security number fraud. He could have fought it. He didn't. The Ashford family has very good lawyers. He understood that fighting would have made it worse. What about the marriage license? They are not pursuing that. The Ashford family did not press charges. They wanted it to be over. And Patricia? She is not being prosecuted. Her cooperation was full and immediate. The federal prosecutor has decided that a 64-year-old grieving widow who lost her husband and was manipulated by her son does not serve the public interest. Good. Yes, ma'am. Sullivan. Yes. Thank you. For believing me. From the first day. Sullivan was quiet for a moment. Ms. Halloran, I will tell you something. The day you walked into that diner, I knew within 10 minutes that you were telling the truth. You weren't asking me to confirm something. You were asking me to help you face it. There is a difference. The women who come in delusional, they want me to confirm. The women who are right, they want help. You wanted help. Maggie wiped her eyes. Thank you, Sullivan. Ma'am, there is one more thing. The insurance company is going to come after Patricia for the $250,000, civilly. She does not have it. She spent some, gave some to him, has very little left. A lawyer named Owen Bradley contacted me yesterday. He thinks you may have a claim against the estate that could leverage her exposure into something useful. He would like to meet with you. Pro bono. He says he was deeply moved by the case. Maggie wrote down Owen Bradley's number. She did not know, yet, that he was 42 and single and exactly Tess's idea of her type. She did not know, yet, that he would call her 2 months later about a different matter and that they would end up talking for 40 minutes about a book they had both read. She did not know, yet, that they would have a first date in late April at a Thai restaurant where she would order the green curry and he would order the pad see ew, and they would split a piece of mango sticky rice for dessert. She did not know, yet, that he would walk her to her car and that he would not try to kiss her, which she would appreciate, and that he would say, I would like to do this again. I am in no hurry. Take whatever time you need. She did not know any of that, but she wrote down his number. She felt, for the first time in a long time, the small flutter of a door opening, somewhere far down a hallway. She did not walk through it. She just noticed it was open. In April, on a Tuesday afternoon, Eleanor called her. Sweetheart, how are you? I'm good, Mom. Are you eating? Yes, Mom. Are you sleeping? Yes, Mom. Did you call that lawyer back? I'm seeing him on Saturday. Good. Sweetheart, your father, before he died, he told me something. I have been thinking about it. What? He said you can tell when someone has truly come back to themselves. They start buying flowers for their own house. Maggie was silent. Mom, yes, I sell flowers for a living. I know, sweetheart, but you have not kept any. For 7 years, you have sold them all. Maggie looked around her shop. The sunlight was coming through the front window. There were buckets of peonies, ranunculus, garden roses, sweet peas, lilies, the first lilac branches of the season. She thought about her apartment. She tried to remember what was on her kitchen table. There was a small jar of garden roses. She had brought them home Sunday because they were slightly bruised and the client would not have wanted them. I have roses, Mom, on the kitchen table. There you go. There you go, sweetheart. They hung up. Maggie stood in the middle of her shop. She walked to the cooler. She opened the door. The cool green smell hit her. She picked out a single peony, the most beautiful one, pale pink, the kind that was just opening, the way the petals seemed to breathe outward. She cut the stem. She wrapped it in brown paper. She wrote on the paper in pencil, "For me." She put it on the counter. When she went home that evening, she brought it with her. She placed it on the kitchen table next to the roses. She sat down. She poured herself a glass of water. She looked at the peony. The clock above the stove ticked. The radiator clanked. A neighbor's dog barked, and then a child laughed somewhere down the street. The bright, clean laugh of a kid running home from school. She thought about the woman in the dentist's waiting room 6 months ago. The magazine slipping from her hands, the receptionist humming, the slow, terrible understanding. She thought about the bathroom floor in November, the 7 years she had grieved a man who had been alive. She thought about Vivian, about Patricia, about the little black box on her dresser with her grandmother's diamond, about the new setting she had ordered, copied from the 1953 photograph. She thought about Owen Bradley, whom she would see on Saturday. She thought about her shop, which was busy now, which had a part-time employee now. She thought about all the Tuesdays still ahead. I lost 7 years. I have 40 more. I will not waste a single Tuesday. She said it out loud. The kitchen did not answer, but the peony breathed open another half-inch, the way they did, in the late afternoon light. By the middle of May, the shop was thriving. Wedding season had started. Maggie was booking 3 weddings a weekend. She had hired Joanne, yes, the same yoga teacher, who had turned out to be widowed 3 years ago and looking for something to do with her hands, as a part-time assistant. Joanne was 53. Joanne wore her hair in a long gray braid down her back. Joanne had been with her husband for 26 years before he had died of a sudden heart attack on a Saturday morning on the sidewalk outside their favorite bakery. Joanne and Maggie understood each other. They did not always have to talk. That was the gift of 2 women who had each been left by a man in very different ways. They could work side by side for an hour, conditioning roses, and the silence between them would be the silence of women who had been to the bottom of something and had come back. On a Wednesday in early May, the bell above the shop door rang. Maggie looked up from the spiral bouquet she was finishing. A woman walked in. She was 60-something. She was wearing a blue dress. She was holding a small brown paper bag. It took Maggie a moment. It was Patricia Cross. Maggie set down the bouquet. Joanne, in the back of the shop, saw Maggie's face. Joanne quietly walked further into the back. "I'm sorry," Patricia said. Her hands were shaking. "I should have called. I was not sure you would let me come if I called." "I might not have," Maggie said. "I understand." There was a long silence. The bell on the door had stopped ringing. The shop smelled like roses and eucalyptus. A car drove past outside, its tires hissing on damp asphalt. "I drove up from Florida," Patricia said. 18 hours. I am staying at a motel by the highway. I am going home tomorrow. I just needed to bring you this." She held out the paper bag. Maggie took it. She opened it. Inside was a small wooden box. Maggie recognized it. It had been in Daniel's apartment. He had used it for cufflinks and tie pins. She had given it to him for their first Christmas together. She opened the box. Inside was a stack of letters, folded, yellowed, tied with a piece of brown twine. "He kept these," Patricia said. "I found them in a storage unit he had in Manhattan. The federal agents went through it. They left this. They said it was personal correspondence and not relevant. I read them. I think you should have them." "What are they?" "Letters you wrote him while you were dating, before everything." Maggie's throat closed. She had written him love letters. In the early days, long handwritten ones. She had not thought in 7 years about whether he had kept them. He had. He had taken them with him to his second life. He had kept them in a storage unit in Manhattan, where his second wife would not find them. Maggie did not know what to do with this information. She closed the box. "Patricia, why did you bring me these?" Patricia's eyes filled. "Because he kept them, Margaret. He kept them, whatever else he did, whoever else he was. He loved you in his own broken way. He loved you. He could not let go of those letters." "That doesn't make it better." "No, it doesn't. I know. I am not bringing them to make it better. I am bringing them because they are yours. They are your words, your handwriting, your young heart. They do not belong with him. They belong with you." Maggie was quiet for a long time. She thought about her younger self, the woman who had written those letters, The woman who had loved a man with her whole heart, who had sealed each letter with a kiss and lipstick on the back of the envelope. That woman had not been wrong to love. That woman had been worthy of being loved back. Thank you, Patricia. It came out flat. It was not warm, but it was honest. Patricia nodded. She turned to leave. At the door, she stopped. Margaret, I will not contact you again. I just wanted you to have them. I am going home tomorrow. I am not going to write. I am not going to call. I just needed to do this one thing. Patricia. Yes. Take care of yourself. Patricia's face crumpled. It was the kindest thing anyone had said to her in months. She walked out. The bell above the door rang once, then the shop was quiet again. Joanne came out of the back. You okay? Yes. That was her. Yes. Maggie, you are a better woman than I would have been. Maggie laughed. A small, dry laugh. I don't know if it's better. I just know that hating her costs me something, and I have decided to stop paying. She set the wooden box on the counter. She did not open it again. Not that day. That evening, she took it home. She put it on her bookshelf, between a photograph of her parents and a small ceramic bird her grandmother had owned. She did not open it. She would, eventually. Maybe in a year. Maybe in 5 years. The young woman who had written those letters deserved to be remembered. But she did not need to be remembered today. Today was a Wednesday. Tonight was for dinner with Tess and Lily. Tess had brought ice cream. Lily had brought a school project on photosynthesis that she wanted to explain at length. They sat at the kitchen table. Lily talked about chloroplasts for 9 minutes. Tess listened with the pretended patience of a mother who had heard about chloroplasts 5 times that week. Maggie listened with the real patience of a woman who had nothing to do that night except listen to a 12-year-old explain photosynthesis. When Lily finished, she looked at Maggie with the unself-conscious directness of a 12-year-old. Aunt Maggie, are you going to be okay now? Lily? What, you said... Lily! Tess gave her a look. Maggie laughed. Yes, Lily. I think I am going to be okay. Are you going to date someone? Lily? What? You said she might... Lily, eat your ice cream. Lily ate her ice cream. She kept watching Maggie. 12-year-olds were not subtle. Eventually, yes, eventually. Is he nice? Maggie thought about Owen Bradley. She thought about the way he had walked her to her car, and the way he had not tried to kiss her, and the way he had said, I am in no hurry. Yes, Lily, he is nice, so far. Lily nodded with great seriousness, as if approving him on Maggie's behalf. She returned to her ice cream. Tess looked at Maggie across the table. Tess did not say anything, but Tess raised her glass of wine, very slightly, in a small private toast. Maggie raised hers back. That night, after they left, Maggie sat on her couch. She picked up her grandmother's recipe box. She took out the letter she had written to her 31-year-old self in the inn at the Hamptons. She read it. You will get the years back. Not the calendar, the years. You will get the laughing back. You will get the cooking for yourself back. You will get the dancing in the kitchen back. You will get yourself back. I promise you. I promise you. She had written it in October. It was May. The promises had, mostly, come true. Not all. Not yet. But enough. She folded the letter. She put it back in the recipe box. She closed the lid. She sat on the couch in the quiet apartment. She thought, I mourned a man who never existed. The grief was real. The grief is mine to keep. The man wasn't. She thought it as a statement, not a question. A statement. The clock in the kitchen ticked. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a neighbor was bringing in their trash cans. Maggie turned off the light. She went to bed. She slept a full night. She had been doing that for almost 2 months now. It still felt sometimes like a small miracle. October came again. The leaves turned, the light got slanted, and gold the way it had been on that Tuesday a year ago when Margaret Halloran had walked into a dentist's office and her life had stopped making the sense it had made. She did not go back to that dentist. She had switched to a new one. Closer to the shop, a woman named Dr. Patel, who was warm and competent and had a fish tank in her waiting room that contained 7 fish, all of which were still alive after a year, which Maggie took as a good sign. She went to her cleaning on the second Tuesday of October. She was 45 minutes early because she was always 45 minutes early. Some things did not change, and that was all right. Some things were just who you were. The receptionist at Dr. Patel's office was not a Hummer. The receptionist was a man named Marcus, who called everyone honey and showed Maggie photographs of his 3 nieces every time she came in. Maggie looked at the photographs of the nieces. The youngest one was 4. She had a missing front tooth. "She's beautiful, Marcus." "She's a holy terror, is what she is. But thank you." Maggie sat down. She did not pick up a magazine. She had not picked up a glossy magazine in 12 months. Instead, she pulled the paperback out of her bag. A novel Owen had recommended. She was halfway through it. It was good. It was funny. The protagonist was a woman in her 40s who was learning to play the cello. Maggie read for 35 minutes. When her name was called, she put the book in her bag. She went in for her cleaning. She came out clean-toothed and slightly numb in the face. She drove back to her shop. It was a Tuesday afternoon in October. The slanted, gold light came through her front window. Joanne was in the back, conditioning a delivery of dahlias that had come in from a farm in Massachusetts. The bell on the door was quiet. There were no customers. Maggie stood in the middle of her shop. She looked at the buckets of flowers. She looked at the front counter, where she had a small sign that said, "Halloran Blooms, family owned since 2010. She looked at the photograph behind the counter, her grandmother in her wedding dress, in 1953, with the small bouquet, with the diamond Maggie now wore on her right hand. The diamond had been reset in the original 1953 setting by a small jeweler in Hartford who had specialized in restoration work. It was the most beautiful thing Maggie owned. She wore it every day, not as a sign of anything, just as a sign of itself, of a woman who had loved well, had lost her grandmother, had lost 7 years to a lie, and had taken the stone home. The bell on the door rang. Maggie looked up. Owen Bradley walked in. He was holding 2 coffees. He was in his work clothes. A button-down, no tie, dark jeans. He was the only man Maggie had ever met who could make a button-down and dark jeans look like the right thing for any occasion. "I was in the area," he said. "I brought you a coffee." "You were not in the area. I was driving in this direction, from a location 40 minutes away." "You're welcome." Maggie laughed. "Thank you, Owen." He set the coffee on the counter. He did not stay long. He never stayed long. He had figured out, in 6 months of dating, that Maggie liked her workdays to be workdays and her evenings to be the place where they spent time together. He understood things without being told. It was the rarest quality in a man. She had not known how rare until she had spent 7 years grieving a man who had understood her not at all and had used what he had figured out against her. "Dinner Friday," Owen said. "My place. I'm cooking." "What are you making?" "Pasta. I am very good at pasta." "Are you really?" "I am extremely good at pasta. You have no idea." Maggie laughed again. "Friday. Friday." He left. Maggie picked up the coffee. It was exactly the way she liked it. Black, 1 sugar, hot enough to scald her tongue if she was not careful. She sipped it slowly. That evening, after she closed the shop, she walked home. The walk was 22 minutes. She did it most days, in good weather. The October air was cool on her face. The sidewalks were covered in fallen leaves. A small black cat ran across her path. She wished on it. The way her grandmother had taught her to wish on small black cats. I wish for ordinary days, as many as I can have. She got home. She unlocked her door. She turned on the kitchen light. She put down her bag. The kitchen table had a small jar of dahlias on it. From the morning, she had cut them herself from the same delivery Joanne had been conditioning that afternoon. She sat down at the table. She poured herself a glass of water. The clock above the stove ticked. The radiator clanked. A neighbor's dog barked, and somewhere down the street, a child laughed. Maggie thought about Daniel. She had not thought about him in 3 weeks. She thought about him now without flinching. He was, according to a small news item she had read in the spring, in a federal facility in upstate New York. He had 2.5 years left to serve. After that, he would come out into a world that had nothing for him. The Ashford family had used its considerable influence to make sure no hedge fund in Manhattan would ever hire him again. His wife, there was no longer a wife. His mother, Patricia, had stopped answering his calls, Sullivan had told Maggie. She finally understood what he was. She is grieving the son she thought she had. He had nothing. Maggie did not feel pity. She did not feel triumph. She felt the strange, distant feeling of looking at a man who had been a major character in her life and was now a minor character in someone else's. He was somewhere. He was paying. The state was handling it. She did not have to. She sipped her water. She thought about Vivian. They had exchanged Christmas cards last year. Vivian was in Italy, taking a sabbatical from her family's foundation. She had sent a postcard from Florence in March. The postcard had said, "Margaret, I am taking a cooking class. The teacher is a 60-year-old woman who yells at me in Italian. I have never been happier. I hope you are well. V." Maggie had stuck the postcard on her refrigerator. It was still there. She thought about Patricia. She had not heard from Patricia since the day at the shop. That was right. That was how it should be. Some relationships were not meant to be repaired. Some relationships were only meant to be released. She thought about her mother. Eleanor was coming up for Thanksgiving. She had already announced, in late September, that she would be making the turkey, and Maggie was not allowed to argue. Maggie had not argued. She thought about Tess. She thought about Lily. Lily was 13 now. Lily had asked, last week, if she could spend a weekend with Aunt Maggie at the shop, learning about flowers. I want to know how to do this. Maybe I want to be a florist when I grow up, maybe. Maggie had said yes. They were doing the weekend in November. She thought about Owen. She did not know yet what he would become to her. She was not in a hurry. He was not in a hurry. They were, both of them, the kind of people who knew what it cost to rush. She thought about her 31-year-old self, the woman who had stood at a graveside in a black wool dress. She thought about her 38-year-old self in October, sitting at the kitchen table with a jar of dahlias and a glass of water and a slanting October light. Coming through the window, she lifted her glass. "To Tuesdays," she said, to the empty kitchen. The kitchen did not answer. But the dahlias breathed. She made herself dinner. Pasta, oddly enough, since Owen had put the idea in her head. She added a small jar of marinara and grated some parmesan and ate it standing up at the counter while she watched the news on her small television in the next room. She washed the dish. She dried it. She put it away. She went to bed early. She read for 30 minutes, the novel about the woman learning the cello. She turned off the light. She lay in the dark. She thought, the way she sometimes did before sleep, about all the things she now knew that she had not known a year ago. She knew that grief was real, even when its object was not. She knew that dignity was a stronger weapon than anger. She knew that the women who had been hurt by the same man could choose to be allies instead of enemies. She knew that her trust in other people had not been a flaw, it had been a target. The flaw had been his, not hers. She knew that she could forgive without reconciling, that she could release without absolving, that she could let a person walk out of her shop and out of her life without saying, "I forgive you." She could simply say, "Take care of yourself," and mean it, and let that be the end. She knew that small things saved you. The weekly walk, the morning coffee, the recipe box, the yoga class where you fell over, the friend who hugged you badly, the mother who showed up with a casserole, the flower you bought for yourself on a Tuesday just because. She knew that she had 40 years left, maybe 45, maybe 50, maybe more. She did not know. No one did. But she had, tonight, this Tuesday in October, a quiet apartment and a clean kitchen and a peony jar that was actually a dahlia jar and a man who was going to make her pasta on Friday and a niece who was going to come learn about flowers in November and a mother who was going to cook the turkey at Thanksgiving and a best friend who had stayed the night when her world was ending. She had her grandmother's diamond on her right hand. She had her name, Margaret Halloran, the same name she had been born with, the same name she had carried, unmarried, to 38 years old, and the same name she would carry forward, regardless of what happened with Owen, regardless of what happened with anyone, because the name was hers. It had always been hers. She had her shop. She had her body, her healthy, strong, 40-year-old by spring body. She had her sleep, long, uninterrupted nights, a gift she had not appreciated at 31, a gift she would never take for granted again. She had the slow, ordinary, beautiful work of becoming herself. She had a peony, in spirit, if not in October. She had what the peony had stood for, on the kitchen table in April when she had first brought one home, for me. She thought about the receptionist humming, the Tuesday a year ago, the magazine slipping from her hands. She thought about how she had walked out of that office, sat in her car for an hour, driven home, called Tess. She thought about how, in 12 months, she had walked herself, day by day, out of the prison she had been living in. She had not done it in one big moment. She had done it in 1,000 small Tuesdays. That, she thought, was the only way it ever got done. Not a leap, a walk. She rolled onto her side. She closed her eyes. She thought just before sleep of her grandmother. Her grandmother had said, once, when Maggie was 8 and crying because a boy at school had been mean to her, "Honey, listen, there are two kinds of people in this world, the people who break things and the people who put them back together. You and me, we are the second kind. Don't ever wish to be the first kind. The second kind is the better kind. The second kind is the kind that keeps the world running." Maggie had not understood at 8. She understood at 38. She had been broken by a man who broke things. She had been put back together by her own slow, patient, ordinary work, and by the women who had stood beside her, and by the Tuesdays. She was the second kind. She had always been. It had taken her 40 years to know it. It was a good thing to know. She slept. The dahlias on the kitchen table breathed open another half-inch in the dark, the way they did, when no one was watching. The kitchen clock ticked. The radiator clanked. A small black cat in the alley behind Mrs. Petrov's house curled into a ball on a warm vent and went to sleep. Outside, the world did what the world always did. It continued. Margaret Halloran, in her quiet bed, in her quiet apartment, in her quiet life, continued with it. She had 40 years left. She would not waste a single Tuesday.
So, that is the story of Margaret Halloran, A woman who lost 7 years to a man who chose to disappear. A woman who buried an empty coffin. A woman who, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, walked into a dentist's office and walked out with the truth in her hands. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because the lesson in Maggie's story is not what most people expect. It is not a lesson about revenge. It is not a lesson about catching the man and watching him fall. It is something quieter and something far more important. Here is the first thing Maggie learned. Your grief is real, even if the object of your grief turns out to be a lie. She mourned a man who was not dead, but the tears were hers, the years were hers, the pain was hers, and no one, not Daniel, not Patricia, not the magazine, not the wedding, not the truth, could take that grief away from her. The grief had made her gentler. It had made her a better listener. It had made her, in the end, the kind of woman who could survive what she survived. Here is the second thing she learned. Dignity is a stronger weapon than rage. She could have crashed the wedding. She could have screamed. She could have made a scene the tabloids would have feasted on for a month. Instead, she chose the slow, careful, devastating power of the truth. She let the law work. She let the other woman see for herself. She walked away whole. Here's the third thing. Women who have been hurt by the same man are not enemies. They are witnesses. When Vivian knocked on Maggie's door, she did not come as a rival. She came as a sister. Two women deceived by the same professional. Two women finally seeing what only the other one could fully understand. They did not become best friends, but they became, for one afternoon, the only two people in the world who understood each other. Here is the fourth thing. You can forgive without reconciling. You can release without absolving. Maggie did not have to hug Patricia. She did not have to forget what Patricia did. She simply chose not to carry the hatred anymore. Hating Patricia cost Maggie energy, and she had decided, finally, to stop paying the bill. And here is the last thing. The most important thing. Healing is not a moment. Healing is a Tuesday. It is not a thunderclap. It is not a single decision. It is 1,000 small Tuesdays in a row. The morning walk, the recipe box, the yoga class where you fall over, the flour you buy for your own kitchen table, the first man you let walk you to your car, the mother who shows up with a casserole, the friend who stays the night when your world is ending. These are the small things that save us. And so I want to leave you with this. If you are watching this tonight, and there is a small voice inside you that has been trying to tell you something for a long time, please, listen to it. Maggie's voice was right for 7 years. She just refused to hear it. Don't make her mistake. The voice is not crazy. The voice is paying attention. You are not foolish for loving. You are not weak for grieving. You are not late for starting over. You have your Tuesdays. Use them. If this story moved you, please leave a comment below. Tell me which lesson hit you the hardest. Share this with the woman in your life who needs to hear it. And subscribe to the channel because there are many more stories like Maggie's coming, and I do not want you to miss a single one. Thank you for staying with me until the end. Until next time, please be gentle with yourself, trust that small voice, and buy yourself the flowers. This story was researched, written, and hand-edited by our team with the sincere intention of bringing meaning, healing, and a quiet lesson to anyone who needed to hear it tonight. Thank you for listening.